Good morning and happy Infrastructure Week. I'm Pat Jones, Executive Director and CEO of IBTTA. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar, The State of Highway Investment, Plans, Promises, and Predictions. This webinar is one of more than 100 events taking place all around the country to shine a light on the importance of infrastructure investment. We're proud to support and participate in this effort. Today's discussion will focus on current trends and future plans for federal, state, and local investment in surface transportation. Experts and stakeholders have been talking about the need for much larger investment in highways for more than a generation. Today, we'll talk about what's happening with our road dollars and what's likely to happen in the near future. AASHTO and IBTTA are collaborating to bring you this important webinar. We have a long history of working together on transportation issues, and in 2011, we signed a Memorandum of Understanding to establish closer cooperation between our two groups. Our presenters today are Weifeng Zhong and Jim Tymon and myself. Weifeng Zhong is a research fellow in economic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches issues in macroeconomics and political economy. Before joining AEI, he was a research and teaching assistant at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Weifeng pursued his undergraduate studies at Shantou University in China, where he was awarded a BBA degree. He holds a PhD in managerial economics and strategy from Northwestern University and several other degrees. He has written numerous academic and policy papers and recently published an opinion piece about the Trump infrastructure plan in The Hill. Jim Tymon is AASHTO's Chief Operating Officer and the Director of Policy and Management. He works closely with state departments of transportation to develop AASHTO's transportation policy positions and oversees the monitoring of legislative, administrative, and regulatory activities relating to transportation. Before joining AASHTO in December 2013, Jim was the staff director of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He was the committee's lead staffer for the development of MAP 21, the surface transportation bill signed into law in 2012, and SAFE-T-LU, the surface transportation bill signed into law in 2005. Each of us will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for your questions, which you can submit online. First up, let's hear from Weifeng Zhong.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat. And thank you for inviting me to the webinar. Thank you all for tuning in. It's a great pleasure to be here and discuss the state of highway investment during the exciting Infrastructure Week. I also wanted to thank Pat, Jim, and your colleagues at IBTTA and AASHTO for all the efforts to coordinate this event. Before I get started, I would like to emphasize that the views I expressed here are solely my own, and they do not necessarily represent the views of AEI or its other employees. As we will be discussing plans, promises, and predictions regarding the investment in surface infrastructures, I thought I would lead with plans and then hopefully get to promises in the end. Since the Trump administration started to push for ambitious spending in infrastructure, much has been said about how challenging it would be to pay for it, and this certainly is a very sensible concern. But when it comes to highways, I do want to point out a particular piece in the president's infrastructure plan that does not involve federal dollars and thus make economic sense. And this piece I'm referring to is the president's proposal to lift the long-standing federal restrictions on interstate highway tolls. The idea is, with the ban lifted, and if states find it appropriate, they could impose tolls on interstate highways and then use the new revenues to repair their failing roads. States do not have to do that, obviously, but it will be an option for them under this new plan. In my remarks, I will make a two-part argument for why this plan is a sound idea to fix America's failing roads. The first part is about the economics of road user charges, such as tolls. And the second part is about the psychology behind them. Ever since the pioneering work by British economist Arthur Pigou on externalities in 1920, economists actually have had a broad consensus for years that user charges are an efficient way to fund the investment and maintenance of infrastructure. When a piece of infrastructure is used but not paid for by those who use it, there will be problems. Now, let me use roads as an example to illustrate the principles. Every time a car gets on the road, the driver incurs both private costs and social costs. The private costs include fuel consumption, obviously, and vehicle depreciation and the driver's time. The social costs would be occasional damage to the roads and also adding to congestion, both of which, by the way, would reduce the utilities enjoyed by other drivers on the same road. So in a world without user charges, drivers would be only paying for the private cost but not the social cost. And this is what economists call externalities. The consequence of that would be roads are overused, they deteriorate too fast, and they are too congested. So user charges are a means to correct these inefficiencies. It can take different forms, such as a gas tax, mileage tax, and of course tolls. But among these three tools, I think tolls can most directly tie user charges to the social costs incurred by a driver. A gas tax is failing in this respect, and a lot has been written over the years on this subject. The most obvious drawback is that vehicles that have a higher fuel efficiency and vehicles that do not even take gas, they do not pay enough for the social costs, or even not at all. Mileage tax is a better idea in comparison, but it still has its problems. Why? Because, for example, of all the mileage tax a driver would have to pay in a year, it's actually not immediately obvious how much of that tax revenue should be attributed to a certain road that the driver has driven during the year. But of course, one way to do it is to require all the vehicles to install a very precise GPS tracking device, and then they would have the very precise information. But then it would trigger a lot of privacy concerns, and it can add to the administrative cost. But for tolls, the charges can most directly approximate to the social cost incurred by a driver, which makes the system more efficient. So the bottom line is that user charges, such as tolls, are an economically sound idea to fix the infrastructure. But if you are thinking, I still don't like the tolls, you are not alone, because tolls, in general, they seem anything but popular, which brings us to the second part of my argument, the psychology of paying tolls. While it's typical to not like the idea of tolls, the findings of recent transportation studies have shown that people's objections to paying tolls are mostly temporary. Once the tolls were implemented, the public eventually they came around and approved of them. Central London, for example, imposed its famous congestion pricing scheme in 2003. Now, the share of Londoners opposed to the charge, they actually fell from 41% the month before the introduction of the toll to only 27% the month after. And similar shift in attitudes were also found in cities in Norway, Sweden, and Italy. Now, you may argue that people perhaps came around to the new policy because maybe it turned out better than they thought. Well, sometimes that's the case, but it's not the whole story. In London, back to our example, more than 70% of respondents to surveyed before and after the toll introduction, they actually thought the plan would be or had been effective. In other words, what that means is that people believe that throughout the implementation of the tolls that tolling is a good idea. What really changed was merely their attitudes toward paying them. So the psychology behind this shift in attitude can be explained by the famous notion of cognitive dissonance. According to this theory, people, they suffer a psychological burden when their behavior and their attitudes are inconsistent. What does it mean is that if you have to drive on a toll road and then you don't like paying tolls, you will have a psychological burden. And reducing this psychological discomfort would require modifying one of the two things, either your behavior or your attitudes. And oftentimes, a change of heart is easier to do. So this can explain what happened to Londoners' attitude changes during the implementation of their congestion pricing scheme. So what's the moral of the whole story? Two parts. Firstly, using tolls to fund the investment and maintenance of infrastructure such as highway is actually an economically sound idea. Secondly, we can find ourselves coming around to a sound idea that we didn't like before once the idea has been implemented into policy. Now, returning to the White House plan to lift the federal restrictions on interstate highway tolls, in my opinion, it has the promise of availing states of alternative revenue sources to fix their roads. The public at this moment may not like the idea, but if it does become policy, I think it would turn out better than the American people might think. And with that, I would turn back to Pat.
Thanks, Weifeng. I hope we get some good questions about the economic argument in support of tolling and the psychology of tolling. Our next presenter is Jim Tymon. He's the Chief Operating Officer and Director of Policy and Management for AASHTO. Jim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pat. This is a great opportunity for our two organizations to partner together to evaluate the current state of transportation investment and highlight what's in store for the future. AASHTO strives to have great working relationships with all of the other organizations in the transportation stakeholder community, but it's safe to say that the relationship between IBTTA and AASHTO is an exceptional one. In looking at the current investment levels here in transportation in 2018, when you look at the Federal Highway Program, we're spending about $45 billion a year from that program, and we're spending about $12 billion a year in federal transit programs. But these federal programs actually represent less than 20% of what is invested in roads, bridges, and transit projects across the country. The bulk of investment in these projects is provided by state and local governments. About 35 states have increased revenue for transportation over the last 5 or 6 years, and even more localities have taken on that charge as well. But the federal government has not adjusted its revenue source for these programs for the past 25 years. The Federal Highway Trust Fund is the source of funding for the federal highway, transit, and highway safety programs. The trust fund was established in 1956 and has historically provided stable, reliable highway and transit funding, but this is no longer the case. Since 2008, receipts coming into the trust fund can no longer support the authorized spending levels. We're currently spending about $15 billion a year more from the Highway Trust Fund than we're bringing in revenue. There are a few reasons for this. First, 90% of Highway Trust Fund revenues come from fuel taxes on gasoline and diesel. The gasoline tax, the federal gasoline tax at 18.4 cents a gallon, and the diesel tax at 24.4 cents a gallon haven't been raised since 1993. As a result, taxes on motor fuel have lost a significant share of their purchasing power. Putting it another way, while college tuition has increased by 379%, and healthcare costs have increased 180% since 1993, federal motor fuel taxes have stayed at exactly the same rate during this 25-year period. Complicating the fact that the Highway Trust Fund is not bringing in enough revenue is the fact that cars have become more fuel efficient. over that time period. We're also seeing more hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles on the road. These newer vehicles, whether they are hybrid, electric, or gas or diesel vehicles, are consuming less fuel than the vehicles that were on the road 25 years ago. So we're bringing in, people are buying less fuel per vehicle, and we're bringing in less revenue per vehicle, per household, than we did 25 years ago. To address this issue, the fact that we're bringing in $15 billion a year less than we're spending from the Highway Trust Fund, Congress has had to rely on general fund transfers into the Highway Trust Fund. To date, Congress has had to transfer $140 billion from the Highway Trust Fund, or from the general fund, into the Highway Trust Fund to keep the trust fund solvent. In 2020, the federal highway and transit programs are scheduled to expire, and they'll be up for reauthorization. To maintain the current highway and transit spending levels beyond 2020, Congress will have to find an additional $93 billion to write a 5-year bill and $115 billion to write a 6-year surface transportation bill. When President Trump released his infrastructure package earlier this year, many of us in the transportation community were hopeful that the proposal would address the long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. Unfortunately, it did not. Rather than proposing a long-term fix to the Highway Trust Fund, the administration's plan relies on incentivizing additional investment at the state and local level. That's not to say that there aren't some good ideas in the president's proposal. About half of the president's proposal is focused on regulatory reform. The proposal seeks to streamline the project delivery process to help states and transit agencies cut through the bureaucratic red tape that can bog projects down for years and years. It delegates more decision-making authority down to the state and local level and gives states and localities more flexibility in how they want to address their transportation challenges. One example of that flexibility is allowing states the ability to toll interstate highway lanes. We recognize that this is not an option that every state will want to pursue, but it is an option that states should have as they look for additional sources of revenue to fund investment in our nation's interstate highway system. As I mentioned earlier, the president released his infrastructure proposal earlier this year. It served as a good jumping off point for conversations in Congress. Some parts of the proposal have been well received, others have not. But the good news is it's gotten the conversation started up on Capitol Hill. The prospects of them taking that package as it was proposed by the administration and just moving it forward are pretty slim. But what we'll likely see is different pieces of that proposal being folded into either legislative vehicles that are already on the move or breaking off pieces of that proposal to move as standalone pieces of legislation. To some extent, Congress has already heeded the administration's call for additional investment in infrastructure. As part of the 2-year budget deal that Congress agreed to earlier this year, there was an additional $20 billion for investment income, or for infrastructure investment included as part of that deal. $10 billion for 2018 and $10 billion for 2019. While this is not the $1 trillion over 10 years that most folks in the infrastructure community were hoping for, it is a starting point, and it does show that there is bipartisan support in Congress for additional investment in infrastructure. We also think that there's a chance that Congress will move on some of the regulatory reform proposals that the administration has proposed. There are several infrastructure bills that Congress will consider before the end of the year. The Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization bill is going to move this summer. It's already passed the House, and it's likely to move through the Senate sometime before the 4th of July recess. And it's likely that some of the administration's concepts that were proposed in their proposal will find their way into the FAA bill. And both the House and Senate have recently expressed interest in trying to do a Water Resources Development Act sometime before the end of the year. It's likely that as both the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee put together their proposals for a WRDA bill, that they'll take a look at the different pieces of the proposal that came from the President, from the White House, and see if there are some things that they can work into their proposal, their WRDA bill and their FAA bills as they move this year. In closing, I think we're in a good place from an infrastructure standpoint. We're certainly not investing at the levels that we need to in order to keep up from an economic competitiveness standpoint. But the good news is that this additional $20 billion that was part of the two-year budget deal last year, earlier this year, is a good starting point. In a normal year, if we were sitting here talking about an additional $20 billion in infrastructure over and above the budgetary baseline, most of us would be extremely happy about that. But unfortunately, we've set our expectations really high. I don't know if that's unfortunate or not, because the expectations should be very high. But in a year where we were talking about trying to get $1 trillion over the next 10 years, $20 billion doesn't seem to meet that expectation. But again, the good news is there seems to be bipartisan support for investment in infrastructure, and we're optimistic about the chances of something getting done in the next year in Congress.
Jim, thank you very much, and I also want to express my appreciation to you and everybody at AASHTO for the great cooperation between our two associations. Weifeng began by talking about the Trump administration's infrastructure plan, and Jim talked about our current investment in surface transportation and the vital role played by states and localities. He also talked about the regulatory reform proposals in the Trump infrastructure plan. I'd like to begin by talking about someone regarded as a transportation and technology disruptor and visionary. About a year and a half ago, Elon Musk announced that he was fed up with traffic in Los Angeles and would soon begin boring a tunnel under the city to relieve congestion. As a billionaire and innovator, Musk has the resources to make something like this happen. As Americans, we love stories like this. The story of someone who steps outside the usual way of doing things and exerts heroic effort to solve an intractable problem. But even if he bores his tunnel, where does that leave the rest of the country with its congested highways, crumbling bridges, aging water systems, and fragile power grid? One big push in LA doesn't solve the problems of an entire country struggling under the burden of billions of dollars in deferred maintenance. We need a national vision to revitalize infrastructure for all Americans. This is what Infrastructure Week is all about. For decades, AASHTO, IBTTA, and countless other associations have urged Congress and the states to make much bigger investments in our vital infrastructure. But we are still far behind where we would like to be. The problem is us, regular Americans. We say we want better roads and safer drinking water, but year after year, we refuse to come up with the money to make the big improvements that we need. But there is hope. Last year, during his first address to a joint session of Congress, President Trump emphasized his commitment to rebuild roads, bridges, and schools. And during this year's State of the Union address, he proposed $1.5 trillion in additional spending on infrastructure. Not to be outdone, the Senate Democrats unveiled their own $1 trillion infrastructure plan that would be paid for by rolling back portions of the tax cut bill. As hopeful as these proposals are, there's a big problem. They're heavy on vision and light on details, specifically how to pay for them. Paying for a grand plan is always the sticking point. Those who advance these proposals don't want to talk about pay-fors until the last minute because they want to limit the opportunity of their adversaries to oppose them. So we get the big vision in the light of day and the messy sausage-making of pay-fors in the dead of night. As Jim mentioned, Congress did manage to come up with an additional $20 billion in funding for infrastructure over 2 years in the $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill that was signed into law in March. But that is a far cry from what is needed. I think we need to level with the American people. Many people complain that my taxes already pay for infrastructure investment, but they may not understand how cautious their political leadership have been for decades to avoid increasing taxes or other revenue sources, even to maintain the mileage or the systems that currently exist. The states, as Jim pointed out, have been much more aggressive and successful in working to meet these demands, but at the federal level, we're barely treading water. It's time to treat the American people like adults and explain the need for bigger infrastructure investment in the form of taxes and user fees. Adults understand that there's no free lunch and there are no free roads. Congress needs to hear this from the public. Poor roads and congestion are unacceptable, and losing access due to failed roads and bridges is unthinkable. Let's have an honest conversation that starts like this. We are going to build and maintain the finest infrastructure in the world, and we, the American people, are going to pay for it. Now, hold on to your hats, because I'm about to tell you something that doesn't often happen these days in Washington. The Trump administration has proposed a change in federal law that was also supported by the Obama administration. Both President Trump and President Obama asked Congress to lift the ban on tolling interstate highways for the purpose of reconstruction. Many of the nation's interstate highways are 50 and 60 years old, and many states lack the resources to rebuild them. It's also important to note that Congress has not raised the federal gas tax since 1993, and as Jim pointed out, has transferred more than $140 billion from the general fund to the Highway Trust Fund. This is not sustainable. If you remember nothing else about what I say today, I want you to remember this. We should urge the Congress of the United States to lift the prohibition on tolling interstate highways for the purpose of reconstruction. Let the states have access to one more tool in the toolbox. This is not a mandate. No state would be required to toll their interstate highways. This simply would give the states an option, the flexibility to choose tolling if it makes sense for them. Growth in tolling is already happening. New tolling and price-managed lanes initiatives are being discussed or advanced in at least a dozen states, including Connecticut, Iowa, and Louisiana, Minnesota, New York, and Oregon, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Texas, Utah, Virginia, and Wisconsin. Why is this happening? It's because of what Weifeng said earlier. Every time a car gets on a road, the driver incurs both private and social costs. The private costs include fuel consumption, vehicle depreciation, and the driver's time. The social cost would be occasional damage to the road and adding to congestion, both of which reduce the utilities enjoyed by other drivers on the same road. In a world without user charges, drivers only pay for their private costs, but not the social costs. The consequence would be that the roads are overused, they deteriorate too fast, and they are too congested. States and localities have figured this out. They know they need to find a way to cover both the private and social costs of driving. Tolling and price-managed lanes are perfect ways to do this. So, a prediction. We will see continued growth in tolling and price-managed lanes because state and local governments recognize the huge benefits of tolling for project finance, bringing needed improvements and benefits more rapidly, generating revenues for ongoing maintenance and operations, congestion reduction, and the ability to provide a premium service with linkages to transit and other mobility options. Well, I could say a lot more, but now it's time for us to turn to your questions. What plans, promises, and predictions would you like to talk about? So we've got a couple of questions already. You can submit them online through the website, and Bill Kramer, my colleague, will pass them to me, and I'm going to pass them to my colleagues by reading them here. So here's a question for Weifeng. You spoke about people not liking tolls until they become familiar with them. Do you have any thoughts, as an economist, as to how folks might be encouraged to try it? Try it, you'll like it.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think this will be the perfect moment to talk about probably my favorite transportation story in the history of economics. It involves a Canadian economist called William Vickery, who actually won the Nobel Prize in 1996. But he's widely considered as the grandfather of congestion pricing. And back in the 1950s, Mr. Vickery, he actually tried to convince New York City to do two things. One is to adopt a rush hour pricing for the subway. And the other is that he suggested that vehicles should install transponders, on the windshield so that they could be charged for entering places that are crowded. Neither idea, by the way, was adopted at the time. That was the 1950s. Now when we hear about it, it feels so natural. And so that's why in the 1963, when Mr. Vickery published a very famous paper in the journal, the American Economic Review, he wrote actually at the very first paragraph that I will begin with the proposition that in no other major area are pricing practices so irrational and so out of date and so conducive to waste as in urban transportation. And very ironically, days after he won the Nobel Prize in 1996, he died in a traffic jam, very sadly. So going back to the question, I think it takes a lot of experiencing for people to understand how it would be like being in a transportation system that you have to pay. Now we feel very natural paying for rush hour fees for subways, for metro systems, and that's perfectly fine. So I think from the economic principle, from the economist's point of view, there's not substantial difference between paying for rush hour fees for subway and paying for tolls when you are driving. Just imagine a world in which you don't pay for subways. Do you think you still want to ride that to work every day? I'm very skeptical about that.
Thanks, Weifeng. Next question for Jim Tymon. Do you think Congress will enact any infrastructure legislation this year prior to the next election? And if so, or if not, why or why not?
Thanks for that question, Pat. I appreciate it. I do think that Congress will move forward on a federal aviation package. Again, the House has already passed an FAA bill. Senator Thune, who's the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, has said that he would like to see the Senate version of the FAA bill make it to the Senate floor by the 4th of July recess, which would give them enough time to conference that bill before the election. And both the House and the Senate have expressed interest in doing a WRDA bill. Now, I know that the question was probably geared more towards the massive infrastructure package that the president proposed. But I bring up those two vehicles because, as I said in my presentation, it's more likely that Congress takes a piecemeal approach to this as opposed to taking up the president's proposal in its entirety and trying to get that through the legislative process. It's not that unusual for a president to propose something and then Congress to take the pieces that they like and move forward with it, as opposed to just taking the entire package and moving it in its entirety. I do think that those two pieces of legislation that I mentioned, WARDA and FAA, are very likely to move before the elections. I also think that there's a possibility that Congress takes a look at the regulatory reform provisions that were proposed by the administration and maybe breaks them off into a separate package and tries to move them before the election as well. There are some really good common sense regulatory reform proposals there that could cut through some of the bureaucratic red tape that are holding back some of these transportation projects, delegate more decision-making authority down to the states. The states are good stewards of the environment as well. I think there's this perception here in Washington that if we get rid of some of this federal bureaucratic red tape at the federal level, that means we're not doing the right thing for the environment, and I would say that that's absolutely not the case. We can build these projects and still do right by the environment. States want to have environmental protections as well. They have them at the state level. Let's let those provisions take precedent over what the federal government is doing, rather than having to check two sets of boxes, one at the federal level and one at the state level.
Thanks, Jim. Here's another question. Will the gas tax go away if the tolls come up everywhere? The public will hate to pay both. That was part of the question. So I think I'm going to start with a response to that and ask Jim and Weifeng if you'd like to contribute. So will the gas tax go away if the tolls come up everywhere? This question points to an important distinction between gas taxes and tolling. A gas tax, whether it's imposed at the state level or at the federal level, is designed to provide system funding. So a gas tax is not concerned necessarily about which road or facility that it's going to use to support. A toll, on the other hand, tends to be for project funding and finance. So if, for instance, a state decided it wanted to impose a toll to rebuild its interstate highway or a portion of its interstate highway, those funds would be used for a specific project, not for the entire system. So I think probably if when states decide or elect to rebuild interstate highways with tolls, we are likely not to see gas taxes go away unless that's something that a state or the federal government decides they wish to do. They are complementary fees. The gas tax is used for system-wide funding, and a toll would be used for project finance on a specific facility. Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess what I would say is, the federal gas tax has served the country very well over the last 60 years. It has, as I mentioned earlier, it's the primary source of funding for the Federal Highway Trust Fund, which provides funding for the Federal Aid Highway Program as well as the federal transit programs. It is certainly, we're having trouble keeping up with the purchasing power of the gas tax, as I mentioned. And there are some other alternatives that I think will be considered in the long run. But in the short run, it is still the most efficient way to collect revenue from users that go more to a system-wide approach for funding as opposed to a facility-wide approach, as you mentioned, which is more ideal for tolling. I do think one of the things that the transportation community will be looking at in the near future are vehicle miles traveled fees. This is something that we've been talking about for the last 10 to 15 years, even longer in some places. But that's certainly not ready for prime time when the next reauthorization bill at the federal level comes up in 2020 2020. So I think we're going to have to rely on the gas tax for another 10 plus years to keep the federal programs going. But as you mentioned, it can work in concert with tolling. We're seeing that now in a lot of places. And one of the things that we're all talking about now is lifting that prohibition on the interstate system, because right now you cannot put tolls, or you can do it in only limited circumstances, on the interstate system for existing lanes. A lot of those lanes were built over 50 years ago. States and localities are having trouble keeping up the maintenance associated with those lanes that were built 50 years ago. And we need some additional revenue in order to be able to maintain those facilities, because just like anything else that you may have purchased 50 years ago, if you're not reinvesting in it, the usefulness of that asset is going to decline.
Thanks, Jim. So here's another question. I'll pose it to both Jim and Weifeng. How can we get the public to speak up on the need for infrastructure funding? We've all talked about this, how we need to get the public to speak up. What are your thoughts on how we can get them to speak up on the need for infrastructure funding?
Okay, I'll try answering part of that question first. I think so. The public realize that the infrastructure system is not working as it's not sustainable in the long run. They know that it's severely lacking in funding, but what they don't realize, I think oftentimes what they don't realize is that they said they are paying taxes, but they are paying gas taxes that funds the infrastructure. But I think a lot of people, they don't realize that this is far from being enough in funding. And so one way they can speak up is to, as they would speak up in any other issues, tell your congressman, being more participating in politics when you say select your choice when you vote and select your choice for the candidate. I don't see systematically that much difference between participating in this particular issue versus in other issues that involve your lives. So that would be my part of the answer.
I think the American public, for the most part, unless the system is failing them that particular day, they take it for granted. So I think that's why we don't see as much public outrage that we're not investing as much as we should in transportation infrastructure, because for the most part, it's getting people where they want to go. It may not be getting them there the most efficient way that it should. It's certainly taking us longer than it should to get from point A to point B, and it's costing us more time stuck in congestion and wasting more fuel as we're sitting in traffic jams. But I think we've been conditioned as an American people to accept kind of this base level of congestion that we have, and you don't see as much of a backlash that the system isn't working. I do think we've had more success in raising additional revenue at the state and local level than we have at the federal level. I think that state and local legislators have been able to make the case to the voters, to their constituents, that the dollars that they are collecting at the state and local level will be invested in projects that will have an immediate benefit for the voters. I think at the federal level, we've had a hard time kind of connecting those two dots. There seems to be a little bit of a distrust that if we send money to Washington, that we're certain that we're going to get a good return on that investment. So I think we need to work on that messaging. We have to show the American people that the federal transportation programs are worthwhile programs to invest it in, and that we haven't increased the revenue sources for those programs in the last 25 years, and that it's time to do that. Whether it's through additional gas tax or an increase in the gas tax, or if it's through other revenue sources, or giving states and localities additional tools like the ability to toll interstate highways. But something needs to be done at the federal level to invest more in infrastructure. We've been more successful at the state and local level. For whatever reason, we haven't been able to connect those dots at the federal level.
Jim, the point you make about the important nexus between the individual driver and the facilities that they use, I think points to the reason there have been so many successful priced managed lanes and HOV projects around the country. I think we have something like 40 some price managed lanes projects in a dozen states, and these all emerged in local circumstances where people or organizations or state DOTs said, look, we're fed up with having the equivalent of a brownout for 2 or 3 hours a day during rush hour traffic, and there's something that we can do to address this. And the emergence of price managed lanes over the last 20 years has come about because of all electronic tolling, and this is something that people can see tangibly on a daily basis, that if I am willing to pay to get into these lanes, I can experience a much more reliable trip. Instead of it being 45 minutes one day and an hour and a half the next day, I can guarantee that I'm going to have a 30-minute trip because I'm in a price-managed lane and we're using the market forces to adjust the amount of traffic in the lanes and to preserve that speed. So I think from my perspective, one of the areas where we've seen the biggest growth in tolling has been in price-managed lanes because people are getting an immediate payoff for their investment. So we salute all the price-managed lanes around the country and encourage others that are thinking about doing this to get into the ballgame. Well, here's another question for both Jim and Weifeng. A crystal ball question. Post the midterm elections, so after November of 2018, will Congress address the Highway Trust Fund? And I assume that the questioner is asking about the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. And will they let states do more? So who would like to start with that? Jim, you want to start?
I can try first. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Weifeng.
So I guess it pretty much depends on who won the midterm and who controls what. I guess, I mean, from American perspectives, American voters' perspectives, there's a lot of polarization in politics in Washington. And what the most direct and severe damage, in my opinion, is really on the interests of the American voters. So this is why I think, lifting the ban on interstate highway tolls would have more direct effect than what we might think, because when things get down to state level and localities, it's often easier. It's part of the reason why federalism works very well, because you have more say as a voter in a lower level relative to the federal level, especially when in the time there's so much polarization in politics in Washington and very few things can get done. And so that's why I said, it depends on who won and who controls what.
So I do think that this is going to be a tough issue regardless of who controls the House and the Senate after the midterm elections. The Highway Trust Fund started running into solvency issues in 2008 towards the end of the Bush administration. It was in peril during the entire Obama administration, and it continues to be essentially spending more than we're bringing in revenue in the Trump administration. Democrats and Republicans have controlled the House or the Senate throughout that time period, and yet we still don't have a long-term solution to the Highway Trust Fund. So I'm not sure if the midterm elections are going to change that. We've been able to limp along for the last really 10 years by just finding change in the couch cushions or under the couch cushions. I know when you think about $140 billion, it doesn't sound like couch cushion change, but for whatever reason, Congress has been able to find those dollars when they needed to. I think it's becoming harder and harder to find that kind of money. And as I mentioned earlier, you're going to need about $100 billion to do the next surface transportation reauthorization bill. It's, I think, going to be nearly impossible to find $100 billion laying around. So maybe that does force Congress's hand to address the revenue sources for the Highway Trust Fund during that time period, regardless as to who's in control, Democrats or Republicans. But we'll have to wait and see, I think, until after the midterms, and then in 2020 when the current surface transportation programs expire.
Thanks, Jim. And Weifeng, thank you very much. Here's another question. This is kind of a deep and broad question. It's about equity. So the questioner writes, tolls are user fees. If you use it, you pay for it. If not, you do not. There are complaints about the equity of access and cost of various transportation systems, transit, fuel taxes, tolls, and suggestions that these should be made more equitable. What are your thoughts on the equity of various forms of transportation funding and finance?
Thank you, Pat. I think this is a very fair question. A lot of criticisms, at least a large fraction of them against tolling would be that it's regressive, because poor people, they tend to pay more as a fraction of their income when they use systems that has tolling or congestion pricing, for example. But I think it will be helpful to distinguish two issues. We have been talking about transportation and how to fund and maintain infrastructures. That's something that has to be done, and it involves people's lives. But being regressive, it's a fair comment, but I think resolving whether a tax system is progressive enough or regressive, or how problematic that is, should be a different policy issue. The government could have other ways to alleviate these burdens, the burdens of tolls on lower income families. But I think it should be a separate policy discussion as opposed to mixing the two when we talk about transportation.
I agree. I think that no matter what the revenue source that you're looking at, there's going to be an equity argument, whether it's tolls, the gas tax, vehicle miles traveled fee. I think you'll have economists out there arguing that it has an adverse impact on lower income folks. The bottom line is we need additional revenue, additional funding for transportation infrastructure. The user fee approach has worked very well on the highway side for the past 60 years. It's something that I think users of the system are familiar with, whether it's through the gas tax, which serves as a proxy for use, or through tolls. The equity issues, I think, are always going to be there, and it's something that policymakers are going to have to address as they consider revenue options for the Highway Trust Fund and for the federal transportation programs in the future.
All right, thank you, Jim and Weifeng. Here is one more question. I think this will probably be our last because we're about 7 minutes from the top of the hour. How do we get the voters and citizens to trust that the federal, state, and local governments will do what is right and needed for infrastructure? This may be key to future funding approval. Thoughts about that?
I think this is a very good principle to have on any issues that citizens want their government to do. I think a lot of it rests on whether states or localities, when they impose tolls, whether they disclose or they let their residents know what the monies will be used at, whether it's through maintaining the current roads or possibly invest in another new road. I think it's the same even at the federal level. Actually, voters, they may not realize this, but now the Federal Highway, the trust fund, is close to insolvency. So every now and then, the federal government has to move, billions of dollars into the fund to keep it moving. And if we think about it, the tax we paid that goes into the general fund, they are not supposed to be used on transportation because it's never specified like that for the voters. But when the government moves funds from the general funds, move money from the general funds to the highway funds, it's actually a misattribution of what the money is supposed to be spent on. So it all comes down to the accountability issue of voters needing to know and be and have it specified where money is used for. And the same principle should be applied on all the other user fee programs such as tolls or vehicle miles travel. And I think this is a much general principles that voters should enforce on their governments, whichever level of the governmental system we are talking about.
I think we have achieved that level of accountability and credibility at the state and local level. As I mentioned earlier, you've seen about 35 states over the last 5 or 6 years increase revenue for transportation, as well as a number of localities. You've seen that happen in blue states and red states. It hasn't been a kind of a Republican or a Democrat issue. We've seen success in places that I think most people would be surprised to hear that they voted for a tax increase in the way of a gas tax increase. So, they've done that at the state and local level and have been successful. We used to say that they were more successful if they tied it specifically to projects, but we've seen a number of state and local measures that have made it across the finish line that have not identified specific projects. So I don't know if it's project-based. There just seems to be more trust from the voters in state and local officials and the decisions that they're making, I think, than there is at the federal level. I'll also point out that at the federal level, the problem is bigger than most states and localities are tackling. In order to bring in $15 billion in revenue to match what we're spending, we need to increase the gas tax by 12 to 15 cents. So you're looking at essentially an 80% increase in what the current gas tax is in order to just pay for what we're spending right now. That's a hard sell at the federal level. At the state and local level, they're talking about an increase in the gas tax, and they're talking about additional investment they're able to make because of the increase that they're asking for. At the federal level, you'll need 15 cents likely just to pay for what we're currently spending. If you want to spend more than that, we're going to have to increase the gas tax even more. That's a hard political sell for both Democrats and Republicans here in Washington, especially when there seems to be a little bit of a distrust at the state and local level with the constituents about sending dollars to Washington and not knowing what they're getting back in return.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank Jim Tymon from AASHTO and Weifeng Zhong from the American Enterprise Institute for joining me today for this webinar. We thank you for joining us, the viewers. We've had over 200 viewers, and we will post this webinar, a video of this webinar, on both the AASHTO and the IBTTA websites. You can find AASHTO at www.transportation.org, and IBTTA is www.ibtta.org. And if you're interested in more content related to Infrastructure Week or transportation funding and finance, I'll promote IBTTA's Summit on Finance and Policy that will take place in Portland, Oregon, July 22 through 24. You can learn more about that at ibtta.org. Once again, thanks to Jim Tymon, Weifeng Zhong, and thanks to AASHTO for providing their facilities for this webinar. Have a great Infrastructure Week, and we'll see you soon.